Now we go to the alarming actions of China, with Biden asleep at the switch, dazed and mentally dwindled. China is ramping up its global interference, cutting vital undersea cables in the Baltic. I speak of the chief suspect, the Chinese vessel E25, which seems to be rehearsing for the takeover of Taiwan.
And now, The Edwin Black Show. Sponsored by the Books of Edwin Black, available on Amazon and at booksellers worldwide. And now, here's Edwin.
Welcome to the Edwin Black Show, coming to you twice monthly from Washington, D.C. Hello, I'm Edwin Black, investigative journalist, historian, and author of 225 editions in 40 languages in 190 countries worldwide, including IBM and the Holocaust, War Against the Weak, and The Farhud, as well as many other books. This is a show for opinion makers and decision makers, not mass clicks. So if you think our show's content is meaningful, spread the word throughout your most informed networks. Subscribe for free alerts at theedwinblackshow.com. And if you want to support our work, please visit theedwinblackshow.com/support. Your help, big or small, assures our complete and utter intellectual and uncensored journalistic independence. Year-end giving is now. Go to theedwinblackshow.com/support and keep us independent. Today's episode is made possible and sponsored without any preconditions, requests, or stipulations by the historic re-release of the abridged IBM and the Holocaust audiobook narrated by me and just re-released at Amazon, Audible, iTunes, and wherever audiobooks are found worldwide. And our show is co-sponsored by members of both the Dallas and San Francisco Jewish communities. If you would like to honor someone with a sponsorship, contact us. That said, remember, I only speak for myself and for history. The same goes for my guests. Today, we welcome viewers from across America, including our 4 watch parties in the villages, Newton, Mass., Chicago, and Tampa Bay. Harvey is in the house. Overseas, I see viewers logged on from most of our usuals: Australia, New Zealand again, Deutschland, Germany, Austria, Holland, Sweden once more, thank you, France, Italy, Spain, Hungary, Poland, Japan, Great Britain, Canada, of course, Mexico, Brazil, Nigeria, and Israel, plus other countries. If you have a question, place one short sentence in Zoom's QA feature. The Edwin Black Show, along with our YouTube site, is global and fast-growing, enjoying many scores of thousands of views. We speak frankly and without tremor to a fragmented world, seeking better understanding of our tormented past, our present very, very tense, and a future still uncertain. By the way, stay tuned for my special word of wisdom at the very end of the show, just before I sign off. But first, some reports of top importance. I want to start with an unfolding nationwide, that is countrywide, assault against Jews in Canada. Yes, Canada. Once the utopia, Canada has now descended into a dystopia for human rights and individual freedoms. But in that breakdown of norms, we see that Canada is now being called the North American capital of the worst sort of anti-Semitism. I call upon contributing editor and our privacy guru, Sharon Polsky, who keeps us informed on all things Canadian. Sharon, what has happened with the explosion of violent anti-Semitism in Montreal, Toronto, and in Canada generally? Who's responsible? Take it, Sharon.
Well, I'll tell you, Edwin, Canada has changed from the land of milk and honey that people escaping pogroms and communism fled to a century ago. And President-elect Trump is not the only American who's expressed concern about the northern border and the surge of unvetted immigrants who've come to Canada recently. With a largely undefended border, of course, that is a threat to the US and to Canada and Canadians, starting with the Jewish population, as we've seen. In the year since October 7th, the pro Gaza, pro Hamas, anti Israel, anti Semitic demonstrators have run rampant, or should I say, they've been allowed to run rampant, even as Jewish groups and leaders have repeatedly called for police to enforce existing laws that prohibit the support of terrorist organizations and other laws that ban hate crimes and things like inciting murder. But the lack of political condemnation has given tacit license for the hateful conduct. Just this week, the Jewish Medical Association of Ontario released survey results that show that more than 80% of Jewish medical practitioners have faced anti-Semitism at work in the last year. That's up from single-digit numbers prior. The 30% of doctors in Canada are considering leaving the country. Meantime, 98%, I'll repeat, 98% of Jewish doctors across Canada are very worried about the impact of anti-Semitism on healthcare as a whole. That will have a broad impact, and not only on Jews in Canada. Politicians have repeatedly said that there's no place in Canada for anti-Semitism, but even Canada's special advisor on Jewish community relations and anti-Semitism, a Jewish member of parliament from Côte-Saint-Luc, a largely Jewish community in Montreal, has said little about the man who walked into a Jewish-owned business there, threatened to kill the owners, then all of the Jews one by one, and then named streets in the neighborhood where that MP lives. A police report was filed, but nothing's come of it. Police have arrested people, including journalists, for being Jewish in public because their mere presence might incite violence, even though the Supreme Court of Canada unanimously said that police cannot arrest someone acting lawfully just in the hope of preventing others breaching the peace. It was earlier this week in Ottawa, a small group of people occupied the lobby of a building where many members of Parliament have their offices. The group doesn't represent the 91% of Jews in Canada who believe Israel has a right to exist, but their t-shirts said, "Jews say stop arming Israel." They were arrested. Meanwhile, police have taken a hands-off approach at pro-Hamas rallies where participants called for Jews to be killed. Montreal's mayor said the peaceful demonstration there was about NATO. And while Montreal burned, our Prime Minister was trading friendship bracelets with teeny boppers at a Taylor Swift concert in Toronto. So many Canadians are wondering how it's gotten to this point where this country, in which our Prime Minister has said so often, a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian, we apparently have two-tier policing. And you know, it's hard not to wonder if this government appointing more than 805 judges since November of 2015 out of the 1,195 judges in office has something to do with the meting out of justice that seems to depend on your religious and political views.
Well, Sharon, that's a horrible report. I should say that horrible.
I don't have the imagination to make this stuff up, Edwin, really. This is going on.
Now, I would just like to say that I have observed that people are running amok in Montreal, Arabs and pro-Arab rioters calling for a final solution and to slaughter the Jews. You've got the makings of a Farhud right there. Is that not correct?
That's absolutely correct. And they are saying, to eliminate Israel, to kill Jews, to eliminate Jews, very blatant. If I was to walk up to somebody in the street and say, I'm going to commit a criminal act, that's chargeable. Why these people aren't being charged, arrested, at least arrested, removed from the scene, and not charged and released, that happens quite often because it's not the police here who lay the charge, it is the Crown attorneys who lay the charge. But they can certainly arrest you, remove you. I was in Toronto recently, And I took the train from Toronto to Montreal. There isn't passenger train service in the west of Canada where I live, so it's a bit of a treat. And I went to Union Station, the main train station in Toronto. It's the train station, it's the main subway station, it's right in the middle of downtown. The next day, it was all over the news that one of these demonstrations, the people had completely occupied the entire block, the front of Union Station in Toronto.
I know that there was a lot of joking when Justin Trudeau went down to see President Trump in Mar-a-Lago, and he said, look, you're going to ruin our economy with this 100% tariff, to which Trump replied, well, then we could just make you the 51st state and I'll make you the governor. Now they're trying to work things out on the border. But I would like to say this, and I say it sternly. It's time for everyone to recognize what the hierarchy of Jewish defense has recognized. Canada is now the North American capital of anti-Semitism in the world. I'm calling for a full boycott of Canada. I'm calling for a full cancellation of all travel plans and vacation plans. Don't buy anything from Canada. This is a moment that duplicates March 27th, 1933, when Stephen Wise led a 1 million-man march to Madison Square Garden, warning the world that Germany's treatment of its Jews was no longer just a domestic matter, but it was an international threat. And I'm asking for incoming President Trump, Sleepy Joe won't do this, but incoming President Donald Trump to force Canada to reform the situation or call for a blockade of all commerce with Canada, regardless of the cost. Thank you very much. Well, Sharon, do you have any comment about that?
Well, it would be interesting. I mean, right now, the Canadian dollar has sunk to an almost all-time low. So anybody from outside of Canada who wants to come here, I mean, their dollar, their euro is going to go far for sure. But you have to hold your nose and turn a blind eye to what's going on.
Well, Canada is beautiful. Germany was beautiful. But what we saw in Germany was not beauteous. And what we're seeing in Canada is now alarming. And now we go to the alarming actions of China, with Biden asleep at the switch, dazed and mentally dwindled. China is ramping up its global interference, cutting vital undersea cables in the Baltic. I speak of the chief suspect, the Chinese vessel Yiping-3, which seems to be rehearsing for the takeover of Taiwan, which will almost certainly begin with sabotaged underwater cables at some of Taiwan's island communities just off the Chinese coast, some within just a half to 2/3 of a mile. I speak of China's participation among the warring parties in the Middle East, and of course, Russia's assault against Ukraine. So we turn to contributing editor and top security analyst Clare Lopez. We could spend an entire show detailing the latest China threats, but Clare, can you pick a few of the most dire updates for us? Take the screen, Clare.
All right. Thank you, Edwin. And thank you to all of our viewers and listeners to the show as well. I know that the time is short, so I'll begin by just saying, as an overview, to understand the threat from the Chinese Communist Party, People's Liberation Army, you should have a look at this book right here. It is called Unrestricted Warfare. It is the warfare manual of the Chinese Communist Party regime in Beijing. And I would turn to a page about in the middle where it lays out about 24, couple dozen areas of operation, military operation against America. Remember, against the world. Remember that in 2019, the Chinese Communist Party literally declared a people's war against the United States. Among the military areas, methods of operation are atomic warfare, diplomatic warfare, financial warfare, trade warfare, many more let me mention this one, biochemical warfare. And from there, I'm going to turn to the very recent report that was just put out by the U.S. House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic. And I want to mention here that the Chinese Communist Party and the PLA, People's Liberation Army, have jointly run an offensive biological weapons program in China for the last 70 years. No, it did not come from America. They did not learn how to do gain of function from America. They got that from the Soviets way back. And so the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, that came out of the PLA labs. No, not the Wuhan Institute of Virology, although it may have escaped from there or been released from there in some way, but the actual development in the labs of the SARS-CoV-2 was in the PLA military labs. I'll also mention here chemical warfare, and that has to do with fentanyl especially, which coming across our U.S. southern border from Mexico kills about 100,000 Americans every single year, and China is doing that without deploying a single tank, troop, ship, or plane. The precursor chemicals for the production of fentanyl come from China. They are sent to the Mexican drug cartels, which mix it up, press out the pills, and ship it across our border. Just listening to Sharon right now reminds me, this is going on in Canada also. The precursor chemicals for fentanyl in particular coming from China into especially Western Canada, British Columbia, Alberta too, where the labs on Canadian soil mix it up and ship the finished fentanyl across our border. That is why President Trump, in addition to the influx of illegal aliens, is also singling out Canada for a threat of sanctions. Okay, let me move on very quickly because there's so much more. I want to mention the fact that China's military, its People's Liberation Army, has been ramping up production of all kinds of weaponry. They now have many more ships, for example, a sea than we do. They have well over 300 surface vessels, that is. We have fewer than 300. And we're going to hold the Western Pacific as we would look at it from this perspective, the East China Sea. Let's think about that. The other thing that we have allowed to slip here in the United States to our detriment as China ramps up is our industrial base. We do not have the kind of industrial base as we did before, let's say, World War II. We just don't have it. And so there are many areas of the military and production of critical military weaponry, ammunition, and so forth that we are simply not making. Recent war games depicting a conflict, let's say in the South China Sea, show the United States not coming out on top. One of the things that we sorely lack is any kind of defense of our electrical system, our electrical grid here in the United States. China has not only a nuclear weapons capability, they also have an EMP capability, electromagnetic pulse capability, which can be triggered with a nuclear explosion in the high atmosphere. We have basically no defense against that. We also, by the way, in the United States, we have no missile or radar defense along our Atlantic or our Gulf coasts. None. We have no way to tell what is coming at us up from the south. Our defenses are primarily located towards the west and the north in conjunction with Canada in NORAD, the North American Defense System. We also have an influx across our southern border in particular of hundreds and thousands of young military-age Chinese men. This continues because our southern border is wide open. Among those men coming up, and though they are not going through the ports of entry, they're coming in between the ports of entry, which are not guarded because our CBP, Customs and Border Protection agents, are all processing paperwork at the actual official ports of entry. Well, among those thousands, 10 to 15,000, we're not sure How many of them can be identified as a Special Operations Battalion of the PLA? Their nickname is called the Jungle Tigers. They are here. They're inside of our country right now waiting for orders. China has a command and control military post on the island of Cuba, in addition to all of its other presence in the United States, police stations, special service stations, 4 consulates, 1 embassy, and 1 UN mission. All right, you were talking about the South China Sea, but let me mention one other thing first, checking my notes here. China recently, in response to actually quite belated, banning trade sanctions against China by the outgoing Biden administration, China has now banned its export of critical rare earth minerals to the United States. Things like antimony, things like germanium, things like gallium. These are rare earth elements that we need for our nuclear weapons production, if we're still doing that, infrared sensors, and other military critical equipment. China has now cut us off from that. We do not have in the United States access to some of these rare earth minerals or the capability to refine those, even that we do have. China has that. They dominate that, and they're restricting it to us now. Let's see. The last thing I'll mention is the FBI recent report here in the United States coming out of FBI headquarters, warning all users of these things, Apple phones and Android cell phones, don't use them with open text or open telephone calls. If you want to make telephone call or text messaging that's in any way, sensitive or just confidential, use an encrypted app. That is what the FBI is telling us. They can't defend our systems against the intrusion by Chinese cyber hackers. So they're warning us, go to encrypted apps. And then I guess the last thing I'll mention, Edwin, you did talk about the East China Sea and escalating war games by China against Taiwan. We have many allies in that region, to include Japan, very close by. Of course, Taiwan itself is connected to us. We are connected to it by promises of providing defense to it in terms of weaponry. I don't mean military, but I mean weaponry. That deterrence apparently is well eroded for the United States at this juncture, a very delicate, dangerous juncture we have right now between our November 5th elections, during which our former and now future President Donald Trump was reelected. But between now and Inauguration Day, January 20th, 2025, is a very dangerous open window. The last thing I'll mention in terms of that East China Sea and Taiwan threat, a GAO, that's our Government Accounting Office, just put out a report very recently here in the United States mentioning that our amphibious ships for the transport of United States Marines, which would be our primary amphibious force to get to an area of threat or battle, are in poor condition. Surprise. And they need all kinds of time to be repaired, replaced, and we don't have it. So on that dismal note, let me stop here before I run way over time. Thank you, Edwin.
Claire, that was lousy. I mean, that is depressing. By the way, did you and Sharon work out your wardrobes beforehand? You seem to have the same color.
All coordinated.
Well, we like a coordinated crew. But I made a couple of notes. Everything you say is correct and understated. Now, I want to talk about this takeover of Taiwan, which will begin not with the Taiwan main island, but dozens of other Taiwanese offshore islands that are within 1 to 3 miles of the Chinese coast, with hundreds of thousands of Taiwanese there. And China's going to blockade those, cut the cables with the Liping ship, and then go down and blockade the Philippine Straits and we're not going to be able to come in, just as you said. But what you didn't say that is important is that we only have a 2-week supply of weaponry to fight the battle there. And I also note that most of our Pacific fleet is sitting in the Middle East, and China has done everything it can to help Iran and the Middle East go to flame. And so it's a dire matter indeed. Now, the grid, they're in the grid. They're actually physically in the grid. They have spy devices in the port cranes. So let me just ask you in words of one syllable. Can this happen before January 20th? Can we see an outbreak?
We sure could. As I said, this is a window of vulnerability because we have a lame duck administration that is not only in this in-between period of time between election and inauguration, but we don't even know where our leadership is. We don't know where the president or the vice president are on any given day or what they're doing. I guess our president recently was in Angola, in Luanda, its capital, on an African trip there. But as far as defending the homeland, no, they're not here. But let me mention really quickly, take you up on that point about components, Chinese-made components inside of our electrical grid, in particular, those great big high voltage transformers. And we foolishly have incorporated actual components in them made by China in China. They're inside the high voltage electric transformers, and they can be triggered remotely, on, off, whatever, remotely by AI. Now think again to what I just told you about how many Chinese military special operations battalion personnel are inside the United States. And in addition to, as I said, 4 consulates, 1 embassy, 1 UN mission, 5 or 7 police stations, and I don't know how many special service stations with the command and control post on Cuba.
All right, listen, I know Steve is listening, and I know that Steve cares about the grid, and the grid is vulnerable. I personally know of a person in the clandestine services whose sole job was to insert malware into electrical systems that could bring them down. So this is a capability that does exist. I wish we could do more, and we will do more on our next edition of the China Threat. I want to thank our producer, Christine, for making that happen. Thank you, Claire. We'll talk to you later. Our third report updates you on the latest legal moves to protect the Jewish community and Israel. Our Jewish community is blessed to have excellent legal leadership with organized litigational efforts by numerous national organizations and experienced attorneys. At the top of that list, we see international jurist Richard Heideman, who files some of the most important and difficult cases in the United States and internationally. Richard, give us an update on some of your most pivotal actions just undertaken.
Thank you, Edwin, and to everyone. We appreciate you being here today. Edwin, as you know, for more than 20 years, our firm and others here in the United States have been filing cases on behalf of American victims of terror. Those cases essentially fall into what I'll call 2 prongs. One is under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, cases can be brought against foreign governments that are on the State Department list of state sponsors of terror. Those governments today include Iran, Syria, North Korea, and Cuba. There were others on the list previously, but not presently. Those lawsuits over the last 20, 30 years that have been filed by our firm and others have resulted in significant recoveries against Libya and against Iran and against others. Since October 7th, our firm and other firms have filed actions against the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has been on the State Department list since 1984, and also against the Syrian Arab Republic, which has been on the list, the State Department list, since 1979. And in those cases, both Iran and Syria have been rightly accused of providing material support to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to PIJ, and to other terror organizations. As it relates to October 7th, we know the heinous massacre that was launched under the banner of Hamas and took lives and burned people and beheaded and raped and massacred and injured. And those lawsuits are proceeding in federal court in Washington and elsewhere in the country. Now, in addition to that, we have filed an action against North Korea for providing material support also to Hamas relating to the buildup over the last decades, the buildup of not only munitions, but terror capability with the underground infrastructure, the tunnels, and those cases are now pending in federal court in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. The second prong are what I would call the non-governmental entities. Cases have been brought under the Anti-Terrorism Act and other acts against such entities as Binance, which has actually been found guilty and pled guilty to charges brought by the U.S. Department of Justice for providing material support for Hamas. They've paid a huge fine, which we understand is going to be allocated to American victims of terror through the U.S. State Department launched Victims of Terror Fund. And other entities have also been sued. Those include AP, and they include other organs that have provided all kinds of support by people who were both claiming to be reporters and photographers, but also are Hamas activists. And those cases are making their way through the courts now. A third bucket that I do want to mention is what I'll call a mixed bucket. It involves UNRWA. We all know that UNRWA was created specially regarding what is referred to generally as Palestinian refugees. Every other country in the world that has any refugees, they're treated by the UN in such a way that the refugees are actually given asylum or they're given new homes in the countries in which they reside. The Palestinians, however, are both treated differently and counted differently. For all other refugees, the people who are refugees at the time are the numbers. For Palestinian refugees, if a grandfather fled in 1948, the grandfather's children and grandchildren are all counted, which builds up to over 5.2 million Palestinian refugees. And UNRWA has been getting tremendous billions, and they've used those billions partially to provide education, partially to provide food and aid and welfare, but also to support terror. And it was clear on and since October 7th that UNRWA and its supporters have provided tremendous support for Hamas and the other terror organizations, as evidenced by teachers at UNRWA reportedly actually holding hostages. On the issue of hostages, we know that the burden has been placed by those who choose to make it Israel's fault. The burden has been placed on Israel to bring them home. But where has been the outright demand, which President Trump is now making, for Hamas and the others to release the hostages? UNRWA has been sued, and also in different cases, UNRWA USA, its arm that's a nonprofit, a 501c3, has been sued. The last thing that I'll mention about litigation, about the courts, is a combination of criminal activities. First of all, you do have indictments that were issued by the U.S. Department of Justice this year against Hania and against Sinwar. Of course, they're both dead now. We'll have to see what happens to those cases under the general rules. But the fact of the matter is, indictments were brought. And it's important that those indictments were brought, and important that the U.S. Department of Justice seek to hold the terrorists accountable. But on the criminal side, there's also been the activity of the International Criminal Court, we all know about, that has targeted Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant, and wrongly singled them out as if they were the perpetrators. Those arrest warrants have been authorized to be issued, and we'll see how that plays out. The International Court of Justice, also sitting at The Hague, has been dealing with the cases brought by South Africa and others, holding Israel accountable for October 7th and its response to and against the Hamas terrorists because of various issues that have been alleged of Israeli violations to the people of Gaza. When you look at all of these cases and you look at what's been going on the campuses, we have to applaud every single law firm in the United States and around the world that is standing up, spending their money, spending their resources, using their vision and their vigor to advance justice on behalf of victims who really have no other recourse. We applaud and thank every one of those law firms, as I applaud and thank my own law partners for the efforts that have gone in over these last 2 decades. And as we pursue multiple cases as a result of October 7th, we hope that we'll be able to bring a measure of justice, not only here, but as Sharon spoke about Canada, you should know there's litigation ongoing in Canada because they have similar statutes to what the United States has. And lastly, Israel itself adopted legislation that allowed for Israelis to bring litigation in Israel. There have been judgments entered and attachments are ongoing and monies allocated to victims. So in a small way, it's a battle against terror in one of these prongs through advocacy, public opinion, but also litigation through the courts. Thank you, Edwin.
Well, that was an extraordinary and compelling presentation. I agree with you that your heroic efforts are part of a community of heroic efforts. I want to point out that Stand With Us and the Brandeis Center are just 2 of the many organizations in our country which are working day and night, and I can tell you it's day and night to address the inequities and launch litigation to protect the Jews. I made so many notes. I hope I have a few moments to ask you some questions. Now, did you sue the Associated Press?
We didn't, but another law firm did, and the case is making its way through the courts. And tribute to the law firm, but also tribute to the plaintiffs that have stood up because they're finding discovery to be challenging. But, you know, seeking justice and accountability is not easy, and it's important for the families to do.
Now, the Associated Press is being sued because one of their photographers was actually an embed, a participant in the October 7th massacres, and that's how they got all of these extraordinary shots. I should mention that the Associated Press is amongst the community of collapsed established media. The Associated Press is now laying off and contracting 8% of its workforce around the world, and it's joining such groups as the Washington Post, the New York Times, in getting smaller, less listened to. MSNBC is being spun off. CNN is looking at 600 layoffs. I don't even know if anyone's going to be watching CNN anymore. Your comments on UNRWA were most compelling because there is one rule for all refugees in the world from every country. So my parents were refugees. They came from Poland. I was born in the United States. I am not a refugee. But apparently the son or daughter of any person born to the Arab community of 1948 automatically becomes a refugee no matter where he lives. And this creates hundreds of thousands of additional refugees. And it causes me to ask every time I have the chance, why is there a refugee camp in Gaza? Why is there a refugee camp in Ramallah? Can you answer that question, Richard?
Yeah, those refugee camps have been maintained for many, many, many decades because they allowed a demonstration of the ills of Israel, as if Israel created and forced the refugee camps, when in fact, the billions of dollars that have gone into those areas where there are refugee camps could have well been spent not on oppressing the people, but on uplifting the people and doing away with the refugee camps. On UNRWA, you made a comment, and I think there's a point everyone should know. Much to our shock, the Biden administration's Justice Department filed what's referred to as a statement of interest of the U.S. government, claiming that UNRWA has immunity from that lawsuit. That case is going on in federal court in New York. Amicus briefs and other briefs have been filed. The matter will be reviewed by the judge. We don't know how long it'll take. We're not counsel in that case, but we actually filed on behalf of both Stand With Us, Emmett, the Ruhl Wallenberg Center, and others, including the National Jewish Advocacy Center, as well as the Boca Raton Temple. We filed an amicus brief in that case, arguing that UNRWA does not deserve that immunity under the various treaties that were or were not approved by the United States Senate. It's a complicated issue. We don't have time to go into it, but people ought to know that instead of the Biden administration, and I don't mean to be political, instead of the Biden administration standing up for the victims and say, give those victims a day in court, they're saying to the judge, the case ought to be dismissed because UNRWA has immunity. If, however, you go on the UNRWA website and go to make a contribution as a U.S. taxpayer, it links you over to the UNRWA USA website, a 501c3, which means taxpayer money goes to a 501c3. The 501c3 then gives most of its money after its overhead over to UNRWA. And we know how UNRWA has spewed hate, taught hate, supported hate, and how UNRWA has acted long before October 7th. And since on October 7th and since October 7th. There are other lawsuits we haven't had time to talk about, but people ought to know that those lawsuits are indeed important. They deserve support, and the press needs to follow them more carefully.
Thank you very much, Richard. Once again, another stunning collection of actions that you are taking, that Stand With Us is taking, Brandeis is taking, Emmett, all of our colleagues who know that this is one of our last retreats. That is retreat to the law. And now for my own updates, that is items from the week. First, a promising revelation from the extended Middle East. Everyone knows where Somalia is, at the Horn of Africa, but very few people know where Somaliland is. Formerly known as Puntland, Somaliland is the northeast quadrant, now independent since 1990. Somaliland is an independent country. It has established itself. It has constituted itself. It has a foreign ministry. It's got offices around the country, but it's not officially recognized. And so it's part of an extraordinary organization most people don't know about, an organization of unrecognized nations. For example, Guam, the Kurdistan, and even the District of Columbia are all in this organization. Well, so is Somaliland. And Ethiopia sits just west of Somaliland, is therefore landlocked and really wants to get out to some ocean. The UAE is getting ready to recognize Somaliland. It's going to be building a port right off of the main city, Berbera. And guess what else is going in there? Israel is getting ready to recognize Somaliland. And when it does, it intends to build an air base in Somaliland across from Yemen, across from the Houthis in Yemen. Israel will build a base. The UAE wishes to help finance that base. And if Israel recognizes Somaliland, the UAE recognizes it, Donald Trump recognizes it, and several more, it sets the stage for a true change in dynamics in the Middle East, and especially Israel's ability to reach out and stop what's going on in Yemen, and of course, take down the Iranian nuclear threat. Next, we must comprehend that the failed Democratic Party, rejected by 90% of the counties in the U.S. at the last election, is angered, bewildered, and imploding into two canisters. The first is a fascist fringe that acts against Jews in Israel and supports Hamas and Palestinian terror. That fringe constitutes about half the party. Consider that 40% of the elected Democrats in Congress just voted to ban all weapons to Israel, including the defensive Tamir interceptor rockets used by the Iron Dome. Can you believe this? This vast, controlling hate underbelly of the Democrats is now planning to stretch the law, abuse the law, and break the law in an anti-democratic backlash to subvert the American system and efforts to reform our government and our country and achieve justice through accountability. For example, we can say this. One, we can say, pardon me. Well, actually not me, just everyone who may have engaged in crimes, such as almost the entire Biden crime family. Joe Biden has just reversed himself and pardoned his son Hunter on all tax and gun charges and gone further. Everything Hunter ever did, known or unknown, going back to 2014, statute of limitations, which includes clear violations of the Foreign Agent Registration Act, the RICO statutes, massive drug distribution, interstate transportation of women for sex, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and so much more. But here are two salient points that most people have not thought about. One, the federal pardons do not cover his state and local crimes committed in jurisdictions from coast to coast all over the nation, where it is still a crime to buy dealer weight drugs and transport and distribute them, and still a crime to commit financial crimes. Biden is broadly expected to next issue similar pardons to his brother and other family members who participated in the corrupt schemes to the tunes of millions of dollars. Point two, once these pardons are issued, the Bidens, get this, lose their Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination, since they cannot incriminate for an act they have already been pardoned for. So if anyone connected to the Biden family crimes, such as Hunter Biden or even Joe Biden, is called to testify and does not do so truthfully, they can be prosecuted not for the crime, but for the cover-up and even the conspiracy to cover up. Remember, when you have a small crime and you plan it with two other guys, it's a felony called conspiracy. Now, informed media tell us that Biden is considering sweeping preemptive pardons for a list of politicos, from Adam Schiff to Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney, what is going on? What type of new and startling anti-democratic abuse of the judicial system are we seeing in the last weeks of the Biden administration? True, at this point, Biden is a somnambulist, sleepwalking president, issuing pardons and enabling the destruction of the world order and the approach of nuclear detonations more than at any time since the end of the Cold War. True, as my friend Rita confirmed, when Biden looks in a mirror, he mutters softly, I see dead people. But in his prolonged disappearing act, he can inflict enormous damage on America or allow the enemies of freedom at the UN to inflict it, not only against the United States, but our allies and Israel. Beyond the pardons, we see efforts to lay landmines and subvert the normal American promises of reform that the United States citizenry overwhelmingly voted for. For example, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and their bipartisan Department of Government Efficiency operation, that is DOGE, want to cut trillions of waste, abuse, and fraud. That's ordinary. Among their early targets is the approximately 85% of government workers in DC who work from home and do not come into the office. To corruptly protect this waste, we see a rush to actually enshrine this operation. For example, the Social Security Agency just signed a deal with the American Federation of Government Employees, a union which represents 42,000 Social Security Administration workers, and they are now, by this agreement just signed by Joe Biden, quote, maintain their current levels of telework through the end of the Trump administration, 2029, and this permits them to work at home and not come into work until 2029. Democratic attorneys not only killed the permits for the Keystone Pipeline, they asked for and received court orders to rescind the private land easements that permit equipment to travel to the drilling and pipeline sites. So reopening the Keystone would take many months of new permitting. Ukraine funding. The Biden administration is rushing $4.3 billion to pull existing monies and another $2.1 billion in additional funding to put weapons and contracts with U.S. defense companies, and all before January 20th. At the same time, the Biden administration is constantly threatening Israel 24/7 to not only withhold weapons, and this is key now, it's keeping me up at night, but also to vote against Israel in the UN Security Council or abstain, just as Barack Obama did in late December of the end of his term, to create a so-called Palestinian state. That is, the Biden administration is threatening to call for a Palestinian state in the Security Council, which would make it international law. And this would declare that the Western Wall does not belong to the Jews. What an awful bunch of people these hateful Democrats are. While so many Democrats are becoming diehard haters, the other half of the party is wondering who in the heck is going to lead it and where in the heck they're going to lead it to in terms of the middle of the American people. I see two top nominees. Watch these two guys. One, Senator John Fetterman, and two, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. But no one knows who will lead the new Democratic Party and where its leaders will lead them. That is, if the Democrats can survive their own self-immolation, and if the nation can sidestep the many fascist landmines they have laid for the democratic processes ahead. The coming several weeks, just as you've heard from Claire and many others, until January 20th, is a very, very perilous and dangerous time for America, for world peace, for the outbreak of more wars, and for the Jewish people and Israel. While the planet burns, our president is still fiddling. True, he is asleep, but equally true, he's still fiddling. Now we have a question here from Harvey. Whatever is done in the next 45 days, is this going to be blamed on Trump anyway? Let's ask Richard. Richard, do you think that Trump is going to be blamed for all the wars that Biden is permitting to break out in Syria, whatever is happening in the Baltics, etc.?
I don't think President Trump's going to be blamed. I think he's experienced. He has a vision of what he wants to accomplish for not only the economy and the United States, but for world peace. He has his people out there already working, presumably cooperatively with the Biden administration. But whether it's cooperatively or not, they're already out there. They're making an impact, and hopefully they can help cause the release of the hostages. That is the most important agenda for all of us. When you think about the fact that, more than 1,200 people were killed, 250 were taken hostage, and by the very next day, it was all Israel's fault, and it's continued that way for more than 400 days. We have to ask, where have been the presidents, the prime ministers, and the foreign ministers of the world demanding that Hamas release the hostages? Quite to the contrary, they've been supporting Hamas terror, and now they're applauding the Palestinian authorities coming together with Hamas as if to give Hamas legitimacy. Hamas is a designated terror organization. It has to be put out of business. As you well know, Edwin, I authored an article in 2021 calling for Hamas to be taken out as the governing power and for the creation of what I called the Gaza Protectorate, of foreign ministers based upon historically relevant protectorates. I think you're going to find that the Trump administration is going to move fast on all of these issues. They're going to cooperate with the Netanyahu government. They're going to cooperate with the Abraham Accord allies. They're going to try to build on that rapidly, and they're hopefully going to recognize that there's a need for a change with Hezbollah, a need for a change with Hamas, a need for a change with Houthis, and most importantly, Iran, the worst sponsor of terror in the world. Things have to change, and I think that's what we're going to see from President Trump and his administration. And we're not going to see him blamed for wars. I think we're going to see him applauded for swift kicks, movements, and accomplishments.
That's a fabulous response, and I hope that it was from your lips to God's ear. Ladies and gentlemen, we're out of time. I want you to hold for my closing word of wisdom just 2 minutes away. But first, I want to thank my very knowledgeable guests who shared their wisdom. I also thank my talented international team, including John in Japan, Eve in New Jersey, Rebecca in the Philippines, Christine in Indiana, as well as many others in numerous additional cities around the world. My team, each of them, is comprised of very dedicated people. We all of them. I'll see everyone back here in 2 weeks at 3 p.m. last show of the year. You want to be a friend of the Edwin Black Show, please go to the edwinblackshow.com/support. Give it up, guys. I need the help. Keep me independent. You want to hear me in person? Watch my website for events and consult my events page at edwinblack.com. Until then, head over to any Barnes & Noble in the USA or any Amazon, Walmart, iTunes Books, Google's Books, Kogo, or Audible.com platform in 190 countries across this roiling, toiling, boiling planet, where you can find any of my 225 book editions, such as IBM and the Holocaust and Banking on Baghdad. You want an autographed copy? Hit edwinblack.com and click books. Get access alerts to participate live in future shows at theedwinblackshow.com. You'll see a much enhanced and exquisitely produced version of this show in about a month, and prior episodes by subscribing to our YouTube channel at The Edwin Black Show and click the notification button like tens of thousands of others have. You'll love them. We put new ones up each week, produced by a bold international crew. Follow me at Edwin Black Book on X as well as Facebook. And now for my closing word of wisdom. Remember, whatever you exhale, someone else is going to inhale. I'm zooming out from our nation's capital. Bless all of you. Have a wonderful year end.